Welcome back. We are live inside the Washington State Capitol on day one of the 2023 legislative session. For the next 10 minutes, we will hear from House Republican Leader Representative J.T. Wilcox of Yelm. Thank you for joining us today, Representative Wilcox. If you could give us a bullet point list of your caucus's top priorities for the session, what are they?
Well, first of all, we know that people in Washington are struggling, and we have a difficult economy. It's difficult in some different ways than it has been in the last few decades. Inflation is serious, and it's serious in the ways that touch working families, especially in terms of the price of food. So we want to return taxpayer money to them. We will do it in a targeted way if we need to. We will do it across the board. We want to be sure that the Democrats in the legislature understand that. Next, we still have problems in public safety. And we absolutely think that we have to have a fix for the near prohibition on pursuits, and we have to have a fix for the Blake decision that says the most serious drugs are against the law, and that law enforcement and the criminal justice system may not have the most important role in substance abuse, but they have a role. And then lastly, if you're asking for just the top three, we know that we have a serious workforce issue across the state. There's no one that isn't affected by that, whether they're a worker, a consumer, or a company. And we're also seeing the fact that public services can't be efficiently delivered under current circumstances. And so growing the workforce and creating conditions where people can invest in efficient technologies and people that are already part of the workforce can go to higher level jobs is critical for our future.
So at a recent press event, legislative preview, there were some comments you made that I'd like to go back to and sort of dig into a little bit. On the topic of affordable housing and affordable housing solutions or housing policy in general, you described it as perhaps the most ideologically driven debate in the legislature in recent sessions, and I'm curious what you meant by that. Is there, in your perspective, a fundamental divide in how Republicans or Democrats view that issue, or at least in the legislature?
Yeah, I think there is, and to give you just a quick background, we have in our caucus Representative Andrew Barkis, who has been involved in providing housing to families his whole life. His whole career has been dedicated to that, and we have all kinds of reasons to be optimistic that there's common ground when it comes to making it easier to build homes, making it easier for housing providers to provide more housing. But it seems like we get caught in a binary choice. We don't believe that it has to be a choice of either public or private housing. We believe it can be both, but we also think it's really counterproductive to demonize the people that are currently providing private sector housing, and it seems like the divide has come because the priority bills have been ones that demonize and make it harder for there to be private sector individuals and companies that provide housing.
And on the workforce issue, and we'll come back to housing in a slightly different way, but on the workforce issue, what do you think should happen? What can the legislature do to deal with worker shortages or some of the troubles that maybe have been identified by lawmakers this year?
Well, there are some short-term fixes, and that involves making our licensure regulations less restrictive, so that if you're in the Army, for example, and qualified, you can get licensed easy in Washington. If you are licensed for a particular important skill in some other state, you can much more easily become licensed in the state of Washington. And then we should take a look at things that require a license now to perform, but maybe shouldn't. And so that's a quicker fix. The longer fix is that we have to be sure that we have a balance between encouraging young people to go to universities and encouraging people to go to the trades and non-4-year kinds of degrees. And I think we have devalued the work part of workforce, and it's time, and I think Republicans and Democrats understand this. Work has to be important. We have to value that, and we have to provide all the training opportunities. One more thing, there are parts of our workforce that are not growing, and then there's parts where it's growing. And the growing part of our workforce is among Hispanic workers. A lot of people think that's just talking about Central Washington. Absolutely not. It's every single part of our state, and I was so happy when Alex Ibarra agreed to move over to higher ed and workforce training, because there's no one more capable of reaching out to both younger Hispanic people who will be part of the workforce and older Hispanic workers who are capable of doing a lot more. And Alex Ibarra is going to be a great lead for the House Republicans and for the state of Washington when it comes to workforce.
Just briefly, I want to ask one follow-up on workforce, then I want to move on. We've got under 5 minutes left here. Relating to the licensing issue that you mentioned, could you give me an example of a license that may be one that's being considered about its utility?
Yeah, you're getting down into some policy detail that I don't normally do. But one that you hear all the time is the fact that it's really difficult for nurses, for example, to be licensed in Washington. If we made that easier, we would be able to appeal to a much broader spectrum of nurses where we have so much of a workforce shortage in healthcare. And then the other thing, talking about healthcare, I've talked to a lot of hospital managers over the last few years. We also have some very rigid regulation that says you can only have this many patients, for example, or you have to have these specific people dealing with these specific acuities. And it's not that we shouldn't have regulations that have an impact on patient safety, but if the regulations make it harder to attract people to that profession, or if they make them less efficient when they're here, we should think carefully about those.
So we've got a little bit under 4 minutes left. I want to talk to you about two more things if we can. First, the governor's homelessness referendum proposal.
Yeah.
Can you encapsulate your thoughts about that?
Well,
please?
I think we're open to the discussion because addressing homelessness is important. Is what I said earlier. It's got to be in the private sector and the public sector. And we have agreed to capital budget requests that have dramatically increased the amount of public dollars that are going into housing. We also have some caution. Those public facilities tend to be far more expensive than housing that's produced in the private sector. And one thing that worries me, because you have these people that feel like it's got to be either public or private, if you make a large public effort, do people just sort of dust off their hands and say, well, we've got this now, in 5 years we're not going to have a problem, and forget about all the roadblocks that there are to building and producing private sector housing? And you cannot house all the people that Washington needs to house unless you have the vast majority of that capacity being created in the private sector. We have to do both things.
So on to airport siting, there are 3 sites that were identified by the committee set up by enacting legislation. All 3 sites are 2 sites are in Pierce County, one's in Thurston County. All of these are being considered as a possible the home of a new airport on a SeaTac scale. And King County was excluded from consideration specifically in that legislation. Some of these are in your jurisdiction, these sites that we're talking about. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not in favor of going ahead with those sites at this time, and there's a variety of reasons for that. First of all of the due diligence was done during a time of COVID, and so there was very little boots on the ground to really be able to thoroughly evaluate these sites. And it was also very difficult for people in the areas while the process was going on to provide their input. That's because of COVID. That's not because the bill wasn't well-intentioned. There is one other thing that I think has to be looked at as we go into future process here, and that is we have a number of smaller airports in Western Washington that are underutilized. And before we go to the tens of billions of dollars that are necessary to build all the infrastructure around a new site, we should absolutely be sure that we're using all the capacity that's already available, some of them in areas that are much closer to infrastructure like freeways. So Representative Tom Dent is taking the lead along with Jake Fye, the Democrat on the Transportation Committee, in creating a process that will more thoroughly look into these things and halt this rush to spoil natural parts of Pierce County.
So with under a minute left here, if you could give me a sense of some of the bills you think maybe haven't gotten a lot of buzz yet, but will at some point this year. What are the ideas that are flying under the table right now?
Well, I think one of the really critical ones is Representative Drew Stokesbury, who I would call the father of the working families tax credit. It had been created 10 years ago. Democrats never funded it in their budget. Drew funded it in his budget. Democrats took up the challenge, and we all agreed on that. Under these conditions in our economy, Drew wants to expand eligibility for that. That's one bill that we should do.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much, Representative Wilcox. We do appreciate your time today. And we're just minutes away from the formal opening ceremonies for the 2023 legislative session. Also, please join us this Wednesday at 7 p.m. on TVW for a one-on-one interview with Governor Jay Inslee. I'm Mike McClanahan. Thanks for watching and take care.